Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing a video showing you how I do my lettering in two different methods with some more advanced materials and some super cheap materials, just to show that you don't have to spend a lot of money to do cool lettering. So just a reminder that this is just my method and how I do my lettering. It is not the only way, it is not the most perfect way, it's not the best way. Make sure that you are doing your lettering in your journal how you like, because it's your journal. There is no right or wrong way to do it. This is just how I do it if you're interested in seeing that. So I will stop talking and let's get right into it. Step 1. I recommend scrolling through Pinterest to find a style that you like that has a full alphabet. It's easy to see like somebody's post on Instagram and you're like, oh, I really like how they did that lettering, but it's really hard to try to replicate it and reference it when it's only certain letters because it's just that word that they wrote. So it's a lot easier to look on Pinterest and try to find an alphabet that you like, a full alphabet, and then try to reference it when you're trying to do your own letters. Step 2, practice your letters. So the first thing that you're going to need is paper. Although if you're just practicing, you don't really need to use any kind of fancy paper or even do it in your bullet journal. You can just use regular old printer paper. It's a much cheaper alternative. Most of us have it on hand anyway. Pull out some printer paper and get to practicing. First, I like to draw some lines. So what I recommend as being the easiest thing to do when you first start doing this is to kind of just do a cursive letter in the style that you like. And don't try to do all the thickness or anything first. Just write the letter in cursive. So let's do an A here, like that. And then go in and look, use your reference, or, just come up with it on your own if you want, and see where you want the extra thickness to be, and then just kind of add it in there. And then this would be where you shade it in, like that. Also, when you start doing this, something that you will probably want to keep in mind is to actually make the letters a little bit wider than they normally would be this way, because you're going to be adding in this extra thickness here. So if you normally write, say, like a G, kind of like this, like that's fine and it looks great in cursive, but when you go in and add the extra thickness, it's going to be really, really thin here and like that, which still looks fine if that's the style that you're going for. Like, that's totally fine. I personally like it when my letters are a little bit thicker. Sometimes I end up doing them like this because I am trying to save space, and I still like it. I think it looks nice, but how I do my letters, I usually try to make them a little bit thicker. So when I write it, instead of writing it normal, I kind of exaggerate the thickness there, like that, and then it's just a little bit rounder. Like that. Now, if you want your letters to be really nice and wide, I recommend for circular letters especially, actually just drawing a circle first so that you make sure that you are getting all of that in there. And then they look really nice and thick. 2 C's. And then of course, like, the thickness of the thick lines will vary. You can make these lines a little bit thicker if you want, which I normally do. It is all preference, honestly. Also, I recommend doing some sketches like this just on some regular printer paper or notebook paper or whatever you have on hand, and just kind of get a feel for the letters that you are going for, and just do a couple. Alright, so once you feel comfortable, you've sketched out some letters and you're feeling good about it, it's time to move on to actually writing out what you want it to say in your journal. So, depending on what supplies you're going to be using, it also kind of depends on what paper you are going to use. Some people are comfortable with writing their lettering straight into their journal, and that is totally fine, especially if you have nice thick paper in your journal that will keep it from bleeding. I personally do not do that, especially in my K-pop journal. I do it a little bit in my bullet journal, but not my K-pop journal. I like to do my lettering elsewhere and then cut it out and paste it in. Then I can make it overlap pictures if I want to, and I don't have to worry about messing it up and things like that. So that is what I recommend doing, especially if it's for a K-pop journal. So you can continue to use just printer paper, especially if you're going to be using something like Crayola markers. But if you're going to be using alcohol markers or anything like that, I recommend getting some marker paper. I just used the paper in this Canson pad. It is really thin. It's only 18 pound. I don't think it needs to be like cardstock thick. It's nice and thin. It's kind of see-through, honestly, if I put something else under it, which I kind of like, because then if I kind of mess up, I can just trace onto a new sheet of paper. So I'm going to be using this Canson paper today. Pull out a sheet. So my first recommendation too is, as you saw in the last part, is to draw lines that you can later erase. So I like to draw a line across. If you want to kind of monitor how tall your taller letters go up or how low your lower letters go up, you can draw another line if you want. I don't normally do that because I just kind of wing it on those, but if you want a little bit more control, I recommend doing that. Also, if you have a specific spot where you want this lettering to go in your journal, I recommend measuring that spot and then making sure that your lines are making like a little box of how big you want your lettering to be. I have that problem a lot. My letters always end up being way bigger than I wanted them to be. That's just how it is. So let's start by actually writing something. Alright, so now I have the cursive foundation, and I'm going to go in and make certain parts thicker. Okay, so now that I have the base down, the skeleton, if you will, I'm going to go in and line it with a black pen or small marker. You don't have to use black, that's just my general go-to. This is sort of just like a general lettering that I would normally do. So, a couple of things that you could use are a Sharpie multi-liner, a Micron, a Copic multi-liner. You could even use just like a regular pen, really just anything to kind of outline it, and then you can erase the extra lines. So I used to really rely heavily on my Sharpie. I now normally go with my Micron. I like my Copic multi-liners, but the ones that I have aren't quite thick enough for what I want, and the one that I like is out of ink. So today I'm going to start with my Micron because this is my go-to now. Later I will show you using some other materials, but for now I'm going to start with my Micron because that's what I use the most. Although I typically use the size 03. And I'm just going to outline it. Alright, and I know that it looks really fast and smooth when I speed it up, but I actually go very slow when I am outlining it. Go really slow and take your time because you want it to look nice and you don't want it to look shaky or all over the place. Take your time. It is one of the important keys, I think, when it comes to hand lettering. So let the ink dry for a few minutes and then I will erase my pencil lines. Alright, so once I have erased the pencil lines, I will pick out the colors that I use. So I always use alcohol markers on these because they blend nicer, the color lays flatter, I just like how it looks, and most importantly, I already have alcohol markers on hand. I do some drawing and some artwork, so I already have a pretty, not huge, but a decent selection of alcohol markers between the Ohuhu brand markers, which are cheaper and do not have a brush nib, and the Copic markers, which are definitely the most expensive and have a brush nib, which is nice for blending. So I have a swatch sheet, as you've probably seen in some of my videos, that have swatches of all of the colors that I have. So I will pick out my colors on here. Normally I match them based on whatever pictures I'm using, and I will kind of look at them and then I will pick them out of my little marker shelf that I have and go from there. You do not have to pick colors that go together. If you've seen my recent lights video, I have colors all over the place blended together. But for this video, considering it's just sort of like a basics video, I'm gonna pick some colors that will blend easily together. All right, here we go. So, I am not a master at blending. This is just my method and how I do it. I also typically rely a lot on my colorless blender, which is the Copic brand. It came in a set that I got once, and I use it quite a bit. It doesn't have color, it's just like the alcohol base, so it kind of helps blend markers in. You don't necessarily need it, especially if you're using colors that are similar, but I like to use it, especially if I'm using some crazy colors. So, alright. I always like to start with the darkest color, whether you want it at the top, the bottom, in the middle. I like to start with the darkest color because then you can use the lighter colors to kind of pull that dark color down to blend easier. So I also recommend doing one letter at a time because you don't want the ink to get too dry and not be able to blend nicely. Yes, it is extremely tedious, but also definitely worth it in the end. So I'm gonna start with my darkest color, and I want my dark color to start up here, so I'm gonna color at the top. Now, you also don't want where it's going to blend to be a line straight across. You want it to kind of go down haphazard so that it looks a little bit more random on where it blends. And these are the Ohuhu markers, so they don't have a brush tip, so sometimes they're a little bit harder to blend, but in my opinion, an alcohol marker is an alcohol marker, and it will blend if you coax it enough. So then I'm going to use my lightest color, and I'm gonna kind of blend it down like this. And yes, as you can see, it's not super blended yet. Kind of blend up into that color and color the rest here. Okay, and then I'm going to use my transition color and just kind of color over where the two colors meet and kind of up into both like that. And then I recommend going back in with the lighter color. Going back in with the darker color just at the very top, just to even out the colors. Like that. And that already looks pretty blended. I'm gonna go in with my colorless blender just right over the blended area where the two colors are coming together, just a little bit. And there it is. So now I'm going to do it to all of the other letters. All right. And at this point, you could technically be done if you wanted to be. It looks great. It could go right into a journal. But if you want to take it a step farther and give the lettering a little bit more dimension, which is what I personally like to do, we are going to add a drop shadow. So the way that I like to do drop shadows, I think the most basic, easiest way is to just take a gray marker. I go between C3 and C5 in my Copic markers. I like to use my Copic markers for my drop shadows because they have the brush tip, and then I can kind of vary where it's thinner and where it's thicker. If you don't have a steady hand or you're still getting used to it, I don't recommend using a brush tip marker because it's kind of hard to get used to at first, I think, when it comes to writing lines like this. But these are my go-to, depending on if I want it to be a light drop shadow or a darker drop shadow. For this one, I'm gonna go with the darker one just so that you can kind of see it a little bit. First, you need to decide if you want the light source coming from this way or coming from this way. So if your light source, which it really doesn't matter for this sort of thing, but I typically have my light source coming from the left, so which means that my shadows are on the right of everything. And if you need help figuring out where your drop shadows should be, again, I really recommend looking up a reference photo of some letters with drop shadows on them on Pinterest or Instagram or something like that. So I'm going to do all of my shadows on the right side of my letters. And you also want to decide if you don't want any shadowing on the bottom or the top. If you do, you need to decide if you want it on the top or the bottom. You don't want it on both because then it won't look like a shadow. It will just look like you're outlining it in gray. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to have all of my shadows on the right side and on the bottom of things. So I'm gonna start in here and kind of give it, go down here on the right side, and then I'm gonna do it on the bottom of this and on the bottom of this line and on the very bottom of the letter, like that. Then I'll do a little bit. All right, so do you see how everything is on the right side? So like this is a line, so the line is on this side. This counts as a line, so the shadow's on this side. So I'm gonna keep doing that on all of my letters. And this is something that comes easier with practice as well. When I first started doing this, I could not do it without looking at something. If I did, I totally messed it up and it just looked like an outline. I had some shadows on one side and some shadows on the other side. So you wanna keep it consistent with what side you're putting your shadows on, or like I said, it won't actually look like a drop shadow, it'll just look like a wonky outline. And I just think drop shadows give lettering such more, it's just like a very small thing, but it gives so much more life to the lettering and I love it. So again, you could be totally done at this point. You could cut it out and put it right into your journal. But if you want to take it one step further, I recommend adding some highlights with a gel pen. I used to always use my little Jelly Roll pen. It's probably the least expensive, but it doesn't, in my opinion, give enough opaqueness. Is that a word? It's not opaque enough for me. So I also tried at one point using a white paint pen, which also works really well. But I happened to find this Signo white gel pen just in the checkout line at Michael's, I think, and I love it. It is definitely my go-to now. It's super opaque and super juicy, I guess you could say. Anyways, I love this. So again, you probably want to look up some reference on how you want your highlight to be on your style of letter. How I like to do it is pretty simple. Sometimes I change it up. This is just my basic letters. But I do like a little dot at the top and then just a line. And sometimes I like to make the line a little thicker. A line down the side like that. And on the smaller spaces, I just do a line. And sometimes I like to switch up where I put the dot. So since I put the dot at the top here, I'm gonna put it down here. It's probably not realistic for a highlight, but I just don't like how it looks when all the dots are up at the same. I like it to kind of stagger, I guess, in that way. So I'm just gonna add a line and a dot to all of the thick parts of my letters. There it is, and you're done. And you can cut it out and put it right into your journal. This is my go-to method for lettering. This is not the only method. And you might be thinking now, crap, now I have to buy these expensive markers and supplies just to get my letters to look nice. No, you don't. Stop right there. You really, really, truly don't, and I mean that. I often use Crayola markers in my regular planning bullet journal. And I'm going to show you how to get some letters that are just as good with cheap Crayola markers. Okay, so I realized that I wasn't filming, but I sketched out my letters and then I actually used a Sharpie pen to outline it this time as a cheaper alternative. This is a Sharpie pen, not just the fine Sharpie. The Sharpie pen, especially if you're using it straight into your bullet journal, because it's more of a pen, I mean it is still a Sharpie, but because it's more of a pen, it's less likely to bleed through the paper, where the fine Sharpies will bleed through the paper really badly. I learned this the hard way. So make sure it's the Sharpie pen. I outlined my letters in it and I waited a few minutes before I start erasing it because I didn't want it to smear. So now I'm going to erase it and it still smears a little bit. The Sharpies definitely smear more than something like a Micron, but it still works pretty well. This was my go-to for a very long time. You definitely do not want to invest in expensive materials right away because you just want to make sure that this is going to be like a long-standing hobby before you make any investments like that. So, all right, here we go. Now I am going to use some Crayola Super Tip markers to do an ombre effect. Yes, it can be done and it looks pretty cool. If you haven't seen my June plan with me video, I actually use, I think, these colors as well, straight into my bullet journal. I do an ombre effect, blend them together, and it looks really cool. If you haven't seen that video, go check it out. But I'm gonna do it right now and prove to you that you don't have to spend a lot of money on supplies to have nice lettering and an awesome K-pop journal. So again, I'm going to start with the darkest color. Wherever you want the darkest color to be, start there. And the tip on this one is kind of wonky. I think this is one that somebody gave me, so the coloring doesn't look that great, but just, it's fine. And then on these, I actually start with the medium color next, instead of going right in with the light color, and I kind of blend over that and bring the color down a little bit. Again, I do one letter at a time. It's tedious, but the overall look at the end is worth it. And then I go in with the lightest color. Now, if you are using these kinds of markers, cheaper markers, you definitely don't really want to try blending crazy colors together. You want to stick with colors that are pretty similar, just because they don't blend as well as alcohol markers, so it's going to be a lot harder to try to get them like an orange to blend into a blue. Like, you want to pick similar colors, which is why I like the super tips, because they come in a very wide range of colors. But you can still use like your typical fat Crayola marker. You just might have a harder time blending it together, but it can be done. You can also just do a solid color if you want. It doesn't even have to be, an ombre. This is just what I do, and I know a lot of other people do that effect on their lettering too, so. And I actually know quite a few bullet journalers and K-pop journalers that really only use Crayola markers or Crayola super tips, and their spreads are amazing. Really the only reason that I use alcohol markers is because I already have them. I use them for artwork and stuff, so yeah. Alright, so there you go. You've got your nice little ombre effect. You didn't put a dent in your wallet, and you can be done here just like we were up here, or you can move on and do a drop shadow. So I'm going to use a gray Crayola marker, and I'm going to do the same thing I did up here. I'm only going to do it on the one side and on the bottom. So and then you can be done, or you can take it a step farther and use some kind of white gel pen, or even if you just have acrylic paint and like a small paintbrush, you can even use that. It'll just take longer to dry. And then I'm gonna do my little ball and my line. Don't fail me now, buddy. I just sang your praises. Remember that this is fun, it's a hobby. Don't take it too seriously. And as you'll see, some of my letters are not perfect. Like, this A is different from this A, and that's okay. Part of the fun of hand lettering is that it looks like it's hand lettered. I mean, it's cool, but it still looks like somebody could have written it. So anyway, so there is my cheap alternative. The white isn't as opaque, but honestly that's just because I didn't wait until it dried to go over it. And there you go. That is how I do my letters. That is how I recommend doing letters. I would honestly put this in my K-pop journal if I had a spread. I might keep it and use it. We'll see. But yeah, that's how it's done. Remember that this is just how I do it. This is not the perfect way. It's probably not even the best way. This is just my way of doing it. If you want to kind of see how I do my letters, make sure that you are doing your letters how you like it. Don't feel like you have to do it a certain way because that's how everybody does it or anything like that. do what you like, because it's your journal essentially. You're the one that's going to be looking back on it years from now, and you want it to appeal to you. So there is no right or wrong way to do a journal. Do it how you like and what appeals to you. So here are the final letters. This is the one with the Micron multi-liner and the Ohuhu markers. And this is done with Crayola markers and a Sharpie. So if you liked this video or you found it helpful, please make sure to like and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.